Well, good evening, everybody. It is time for us to get started. We're in Matthew chapter 13, and we're ready to start on the parables. And this chapter 13 forms the third major discourse of Matthew's gospel, where the whole thing is arranged around these 5 discourses, and they all end basically the same way. That once the discourse is over, there's some announcement of it, moving us on to the next thing. So like in chapter 13, verse 53, and when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there, and then that just launches us into the next thing. We saw the same thing in chapter 11, verse 1, and let's see, was it chapter 8, verse 1, or the end of chapter 7? Let me see here. End of chapter 7, verse 28 and 29. So you get a big discourse, and then at the end of it, Matthew closes it up with this formal literary device. When Jesus finished doing this or that, then he went and did this other thing. But what's unique about this discourse is that it consists almost entirely of parables. And there are a couple of ways that we can split up this discourse for tackling it. Traditionally, the discourse is split into 2 parts. As at the beginning of the chapter, he's going to go out by the seaside. All right, so all of this happens around this house. We don't know whose house Matthew's referring to, talking about maybe Peter's house or Jesus' own house, some house in Capernaum, or some house near the sea. But he goes out of the house, sits beside the sea, a great crowd gathers around him, so he gets into a boat and sits down and begins teaching there. And then later on in the chapter, in verse 36, so that first part is done publicly. Then in verse 36, then he left the crowds and went into the house. And so the remainder of that discourse and the remainder of the parables that he tells, that's all private teaching done in the house, and it's just him and his disciples who come to him there in the house. Now, even in that first section, though, much of the teaching is reserved for the disciples alone and not for the crowds in general. So, famously, he tells the parable of the sower. That's done in public. That's just addressing the crowds. But then the disciples come to him and ask him, well, why are you teaching everybody in parables? And Jesus is still sitting there in the boat, and the crowds are still out there, but he's not addressing them at that point. He turns to the disciples and he answers their question and explains to them why he's telling these things in parables. So we get that explanation about the purpose of the parables, and then we get the interpretation of the parable of the sower, which is a pretty decent chunk of text. So even in the section of the discourse that is public-facing, a lot of that is still ultimately aimed at the disciples, which suggests something about the way that Jesus is communicating this that we'll get to once we come to it. We can also, and the way I plan on tackling this, so we can also divide up this discourse according to its themes. We got a few major chunks of text that center around a few parables. There are way more parables told than just these, but you have the first 23 verses. As soon as Jesus sits down to teach, the beginning of that is he tells the parable of the sower, and then at the end of that, he's back to explaining the parable of the sower. Then the next section, starting in verse 24, he tells a parable that he himself doesn't name. We usually call it the parable of the wheat and the tares. The disciples later on refer to it as the parable of the weeds of the field. And so that's the title I'm using here. So this section, verses 24 through 43, begins with Jesus telling that parable and then ends with him explaining that parable. So he's done this thing twice now where he tells a parable and then there's some other discussion and then he circles back around to that parable. And at the end of the discourse, verses 44 through 52, we get a real quick string of parables, beginning with and ending with parables about treasure. And so that's the theme that unites these final parables. Each of these three sections includes a conversation in the middle about understanding the parables. So like we just talked about, in between Jesus telling the parable of the sower and him interpreting the parable of the sower, we get this conversation about why Jesus is teaching in parables and what the purpose is. We get something similar in between his telling the parable of the wheat and the tares and his interpreting the parable. There is a discussion about understanding. And then Matthew himself comes in as narrator and explains to us that part of what Jesus is doing is fulfilling the prophets in the way that he tells these parables, particularly that the crowds aren't going to understand what he's saying. And then we get a similar discussion in the middle of this last group of parables, except now, instead of the disciples asking Jesus, Jesus turns it around and Jesus himself asks the disciples. He basically asks them, do you understand what's going on? So all through this discourse, sprinkled in the telling of all of these parables, there's this question about who understands, who doesn't understand, and why. And Jesus is instructing them, and at the end, it's almost like a quiz at the end of the course, as it were. You know, Jesus, the master teacher, turns to his disciples, his learners, and asks them if they understand what he's been telling them. All right, so that's kind of what unites all of this. And of course, like we've seen throughout Matthew's gospel, Matthew loves to do things in threes. So of course, we've got three groups of parables. Before we tackle these parables, we should consider what they are, like what parables are. We get the English word parable from a Greek word, parabole. And it has a pretty broad range of meanings in the Bible. To the Greeks, it simply meant a comparison. And that's really the core of all of the teachings done in parables. They're comparisons. And Jesus uses that language a lot in the parables of this discourse. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven. It's like treasure hidden in a field, like a merchant in search of fine pearls, like a net that was thrown into the sea. So all of these are built around comparisons. And of course, just going through that list real quick, we can already tell what's the subject of all of these parables. What are they all about? Yeah, the kingdom of heaven. Excuse me, which is, of course, not just heaven itself, but Jesus' following. In particular, in the here and now, it's the church. Belonging to Jesus, being one of his people, being in his dominion. That's the kingdom of heaven. Well, how do we explain the kingdom of heaven? I want to say it's in Luke's account that Jesus even frames it explicitly in that way. To what shall we compare the kingdom of heaven? But that's the exercise that Jesus is engaged in here. He's going to explain the kingdom by way of comparison to all kinds of different things. Well, what kinds of different things? What's the unifying factor here? Well, the teaching begins by drawing a comparison to something true to life. Usually a matter of common experience, or at least of common knowledge. Sometimes the parable stays purely in the realm of the commonplace and the normal, like the net being thrown into the sea and the fishermen drawing it ashore and sorting out the fish that they want to keep and throwing out the fish they don't want to keep. All of that is just completely normal. Like, of course, everybody knows about fishermen, especially people in Capernaum. I mean, half of them are fishermen. You know, you either are one or you know one. If you're doing some other job, you're seeing fishermen while you're out, walking around. Everybody knows what it's like to be a fisherman, and this is all super normal stuff. Yeah. Fishermen throw their nets into the sea, they drag them ashore, they pull out the fish, they keep the good ones, they throw out the bad ones. Nothing weird about that. Basically, all of the parables in this discourse fit that mold. Now, in other places, sometimes a parable will take something commonplace and turn it on its head, like the parable of the day laborers. That one's not told here. In fact, it might not even be told in the Gospel of Matthew. That might just be something in Luke. But you remember the parable of the day laborers. It starts out with something, something true to life that is everyday experience. A guy goes out and hires day laborers. And it was even more normal in Jesus' day than it is in our day. Right? But even we today, like, we know what that looks like. Contractor needs somebody to work on a site, so he goes down, he drives to the Home Depot and finds guys sitting around and asks them if they're working, if they want to work, and he picks them up and takes them to the work site. They work, he pays them in cash at the end of the day, and that's it. Super normal stuff, even for today. But the parable of the day laborers starts with something normal, and then you get a twist on it. Because at the end of the day, the master pays all of the laborers the same wage, regardless of whether they'd been working 12 hours or just 1 hour. That's the twist. That's weird. That's not normal. But that's where the lesson lies. So some of them start normal and stay normal. Some of them start normal and get weird. But all of them are rooted in things that are real, that are true to life. Now, but again, that kind of flexibility, where sometimes they start normal and stay normal, sometimes they start normal and get weird, that kind of subversion at the end of a story, it's an example of how we as readers need to be flexible with the way that we view the parables and the way that we interpret them. So like we said earlier, the word parable designates a lot of things in the Bible. It's not just a comparison. It is one of the words used in the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It's one of the words used to translate the Hebrew word mashal, which means proverb. In English, we tend to separate those things, distinguish from parables on the one hand and proverbs on the other hand. The scriptures don't draw quite so hard and sharp a line between those things. A parable can be a comparison or a similitude. It can be a proverb or a maxim. It can be a symbol or a type. Or it can just simply be an illustration, a story that makes some kind of point. By teaching in parables, Jesus is teaching the way the scriptures sometimes do, through proverbs, through riddles, through stories. And by scripture, I mean the Hebrew scriptures. Jesus isn't coming up with something new here whenever he teaches in parables. Instead, he is tapping into something that is old and something that is fairly common in the Hebrew Scriptures. Because, of course, we've got a whole book of Proverbs. We have several books of wisdom. And even outside of the wisdom literature, we have people who tell riddles, have people who tell parables. Of course, you could probably think of famous parables in the Old Testament just right off the top of your head. Like, who's probably the most famous one? The parable of Nathan the prophet, for example. The Scriptures don't come out and call it that explicitly, but that's what it is. It tells the story about, the two guys, and one of them's rich, one of them's poor. The rich guy kills the poor guy's ewe lamb. And it's a parable. It's a story that takes things that are commonplace, true to life. Do poor people act that way with their animals? Yeah, that's normal. Do rich people act that way with poor people? Yeah, they take their stuff. Again, just common, true to life stuff. And so Jesus is tapping into something very old in the way that he's teaching here. So our interpretations should be flexible, because again, parable can refer to a lot of different things. But we have to exercise discernment. For a time, the predominant method of interpreting parables was to basically treat them as allegories, where every element in the story was made to represent something external to the story. So if we were to go back to, in chapter 12, the parable of the unclean spirit that has gone out of a person. All right, chapter 12, verse 43. When the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places seeking rest, but finds none. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds the house empty, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and brings with it 7 other spirits more evil than itself. And they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that person is worse than the first. So also will it be with this evil generation. Somebody who would interpret that allegorically doesn't just take the story as a whole and just interpret it as a whole, but they would go through and pick out all the different elements and say, all right, this has to represent that. So the unclean spirit, they're going to come up with some specific thing, like a specific sin that the unclean spirit represents, like idolatry. And it's going to come up with what the person represents. And it's going to come up with, what the waterless places represent. It's going to have an explanation for what emptied the house. Well, it was philosophy. What swept the house? It was religion. What put the house in order? It was, they'll come up with something that has nothing to do with this story. But you see what allegorizing does. It goes through and it picks up each of these elements individually and starts plugging things into the text. And it's a great way to abuse a text and make it say whatever you want. Because whenever you allegorize everything, any text can mean anything. It's magic. There is some room for allegorizing in some of the parables, but allegory is generally different from a parable. Now, a parable pulls together elements from everyday life in a way that they fit together naturally in the story and form an illustration. So you take the story as a whole. An allegory, on the other hand, pulls together elements that all represent things outside of the story, and the things that they represent may not be related in any meaningful way to the story or to each other even. So there's a difference. There's also a difference, by the way, between the author adding some symbolic level to his text, and it's something that we detect as readers in the author's intention. Like the author is signaling to us, this means something else. Like in the parable of the sower. This is a great example because Jesus just lays it out clearly for us. What is the seed? What does that represent? The Word. How do we know that? The author tells us out loud in so many words. This means that. Now, sometimes the author will signal to you more subtly that there's some symbolic dimension to the images that he's using. And that's appropriate when you're following the author's cues in interpreting the text to have some symbolic meaning to it. There's a difference between that versus an interpreter just creating those symbols whole cloth for himself without regard for the author's intent and just plugging them in. So, well, let's take all these concepts that we're concerned about, and here's this nice Bible story. We're going to plug all of these concepts into that Bible story and see what the Bible has to tell us about these concepts. You're not reading the Bible. You're not learning anything when you do that. But it is not an uncommon way to treat the Bible, sadly. So we have to be flexible in the way that we read parables, but we also have to be modest. In other words, we have to exercise discernment, which makes complete sense when we're talking about a type of teaching that has its roots in wisdom literature that's related to Proverbs. Okay, so let's start with the parable of the sower. It's at chapter 13, verse 1. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea, and great crowds gathered about him, so that he got into a boat and sat down. And the whole crowd stood on the beach, and he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. Then the disciples came and said to him, Why do you speak to them in parables? And he answered them, To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, You will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom, and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while. And when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. All right, so the chapter starts with the setting, and not just the location that it's, he's gone out of the house and it's by the sea. He starts with that same day. Matthew wants us to understand that these parables are connected to the controversies of the past two chapters. In fact, you notice as you go through chapters 11 and 12, and here into verse 13, all of these things are presented as happening in succession. So from chapter 11 down to this point, this is all one string of events that Matthew is reporting to us. Now, why is he reporting it that way? The exact nature of that relationship will become apparent as we go along. But just file that away in the back of your minds, that these parables, this discourse, is directly connected to the controversies that we read about in chapter 11 and chapter 12. The other part of the setting, again, is that Jesus is out in public at the sea. In fact, we might think of this, if we want to parallel this with the Sermon on the Mount, we might think of this as like the Sermon at the Sea. And in fact, he even does the same thing here in the boat that he does on the mountain. He goes up on the mountain and he sits down to teach. And here he climbs in the boat and he sits down to teach. That'll be a useful parallel for us to hold on to for a second. Two sermons. So we'll talk about that comparison in a minute. The first parable that he teaches is about this sower who goes out to sow. It's true to life. It's common experience like we've been talking about. Everybody knows what it's like to go out and broadcast seed from their hand. This is the way they would have planted in antiquity. Of course, they don't have any kind of manual planters, or automatic planters, I mean. No kinds of machine planters. You just, with some seeds, you would plant the way that we would today in a garden, where you dig a little hole and you put some seed in, you cover it up. The thing about that is it's not very efficient. If you were trying to plant a big field full, how long would that take you, and how bad would you hurt when you're done? If you think about that. You're getting up and down or crawling along the ground. It would take you forever. First, and it's also just not going to be very practical because in most cases the soil is not going to be all that well worked. It's not going to be like, you've got this nice soft dirt that you can scoop out real easy and you plant the seeds in and you pat the dirt back in. Hey, we're spoiled today. In antiquity, what you would do if you're planting a big field, and you're just a typical commoner, is you would have your bag of seed and you'd just reach your hand in, take a handful of it, and you're just broadcasting the seed, just scattering it out. And that's the image here. This guy's walking along just chucking seed out. So everybody there knows what it's like to go out and do that. And everybody knows the difficulty of growing crops. So again, remember the ancients don't have as much control over their planting conditions as we do. There's only so much they can do with the technology available to them. So planting is very much spray and pray. Right? The seed goes out and you hope it lands somewhere where it grows. You hope that it stays healthy. You hope it puts out fruit. So he tells this parable. Okay, well, by itself, it's not even an interesting story. And the disciples come up to Jesus and ask him, why did you tell that story? Why are you teaching in parables? They detect Jesus must be doing something more than just telling a story about a guy who goes out to plant seed. And so they're asking him why. Now, even though in this part of the chapter is happening in public, the discussion is limited to just between Jesus and his disciples. And they're asking Jesus this question because his teaching style has changed. Think about the way that Jesus has been teaching up to this point. And this is the point of thinking of this discourse as the Sermon by the Sea, or the Sermon on the Sea, whatever. Because how does Jesus teach in the Sermon on the Mount? Is he confusing? Is he unclear? How does his teaching work? Yeah, he's very straightforward. He's very clear. He's very direct. He tells you exactly what he means, and he's really brief about it too. So Jesus is relating things to the crowds, just explicitly. This is the way it is. In this discourse, Jesus isn't doing that at all. Now he's teaching in metaphors and symbols. The lesson is not given explicitly. Why is he doing that? So let's consider Jesus' explanation. One quality of parables that we didn't talk about earlier is that they usually teach a lesson that is simple and, in a sense, self-evident. You might think of like fables that you'd have been told whenever you were a kid. Fables are a little different from parables in the sense that they're not true to life. Like the Three Little Pigs, obviously not true to life. But when you hear that story, there's a pretty obvious lesson to it, isn't there? By the end of that story, which two pigs are dead? The straw and the wood, but what's the point of that? What's the point of killing those two pigs? Yeah, it comes down to what they're building out of, and the first two little pigs are foolish. They're just taking the first thing that comes along. They're kind of being lazy about it. Even though they're doing the work of putting these houses together, they've been lazy in the way that they actually make the decisions that go into this house. The thing is, you don't have to explain that to anybody, right? The third little pig is the one that survives because not only is he hardworking, he's also wise. He picks material that's going to last. And you don't have to explain that to anybody, and any 2-year-old who hears that story gets it. Like, no 2-year-old is confused about why the first 2 pigs die and the third pig lives. Have you ever heard a 2-year-old ask, why did that third pig not die? Why did those first 2 pigs die? No, you never hear that. That's kind of the point of these kinds of stories, that they're simple and their moral is self-evident. That's part of the everyday, true-to-life nature of parables, anyway. But, and this is where it gets a little ironic, what does Jesus say he's doing whenever he teaches parables? Part of what he's doing is he's actually making the teaching more obscure. He's making it harder to understand in some way. And that's part of what he says. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. So he's teaching in this particular way to keep some people from understanding the teaching. Anyway, that's the irony. He's using a style of storytelling that is supposed to be simple and self-evident to make his point not be self-evident. And so which is it? Are the parables simple and self-evident, or are they obscure? Well, they're actually both, Jesus says. Because he starts out this way, to you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And so the way that the way that his parables work is, if you get it, you get it. If you don't, you don't. It's meant to draw that kind of dividing line. In other words, if you get it, the point is easy and self-evident to you. If you don't get it, the point is obscure to you. And we'll talk about what that dividing line means and how we apply it in just a second. Wayne, I saw your hand.
To me, he's kind of separating the sheep from the goats.
You're exactly on track with that. Yes. In fact, that takes us to... So Jesus quotes from the Scriptures to explain himself here. He quotes from Isaiah 6. This is why I speak to them in parables. Again, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. That itself is he's already quoting from Isaiah there. Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, you will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and with their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. I want us to remember what we talked about in Isaiah 6 a few weeks ago. This was in our sermon series on Isaiah on Sunday mornings. We went through Isaiah 6 just a few weeks ago. The Lord commissions Isaiah in that throne room vision, and the way that Jesus is quoting Isaiah 6 is a little differently than the way we've received it in Hebrew. Let's go back to Isaiah 6. And if you look in verse 10, all right, Jesus, he might be quoting, I forget if he's quoting from the Septuagint. When Jesus quotes it, he says, for this people's heart has grown dull. It's just an indicative. He's describing something that has happened to the people. In the Hebrew, the Lord instructs Isaiah, in Isaiah 6 verse 10, make the heart of this people dull, and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes. And I want to remind us of something that we talked about back then. It's not that the Lord is taking good, honest people and obscuring the truth from them. That's not what's happening in Isaiah 6, and it's not what's happening in Matthew 13, where Jesus is just being arbitrary and saying, well, you know what, those guys out there, the crowds, I don't like them. Right? They smell bad or whatever. You know, he's just got some arbitrary reason. I've decided I'm not going to let them understand the teachings that lead to salvation, to eternal life, because I just don't like them. I'm going to teach, but I'm going to be mean about it. I'm going to make it so they're going to listen to my teaching and they won't be able to understand, so that way I can fry them in hell. Right? It should be obvious to us that is nowhere near what the Lord is doing with this. So I want us to go back to God's first words to Isaiah in his commission in Isaiah 6. I'll start in verse 9. Go and say to this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Jesus quotes this part as well. God is telling Isaiah to speak to Judah and to indict them exactly on these terms, that Judah has been hearing, that is, God has been speaking to them, but they've not been listening. God has shown them his works, his wonders. They've seen, but they've turned a blind eye to it. And this gets us to that connection that we talked about earlier between these parables and the controversies that we read about in chapters 11 and 12 of Matthew. What is Jesus calling all of these people out for? The people of Galilee, the cities of Bethsaida, Chorazin, Capernaum, the Pharisees, the scribes. Yeah. And that's exactly what's going on here. Bad heart posture. The Scripture's way of describing that is hearing they don't understand. Seeing, they don't perceive. Remember how Jesus condemns the cities of Galilee. If the works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon and Sodom, they'd have repented. If the works done to you had been done to Nineveh, or, well, he brings up Nineveh differently, but if Tyre and Sidon and Sodom had seen these works, they'd have repented. Nineveh, whenever they heard the word of Jonah, they repented. Right? But the cities of Galilee and the scribes and the Pharisees, they've seen and they've heard, and what's their reaction been? I mean, how have all these people responded to Jesus? Yeah, I mean, they've rejected him already. The Pharisees are already conspiring to destroy him, we read in chapter 12. And so Jesus is going to treat them just exactly the way the Father did through Isaiah all those years before. And that's why he's talking in parables. Those who get it easy. Those who don't. Right? Whether you get it or don't is not a function of the brain. It is entirely a function of the heart. Is your heart pliable or is it hardened? Is it open or is it closed? Are you teachable or are you ignorant and disinterested? Keith, I saw your hand.
He didn't say they could not understand or they could not hear.
Right.
Or they...
That he's closing them out.
He said they do not.
Yep.
That's deliberate in the hearts of the people. That's a deliberate unreception.
Yes, they are unreceptive. That is exactly the word. And that's exactly what we've seen from them in chapters 11 and 12. They have heard, they have seen, but they have been unreceptive. And so now Jesus is responding with this. Jack?
Isaiah 6, when he's speaking to Judah,
yeah.
is that before or after Babylon?
Before. Yeah, so he's speaking to Judah before Babylon. But they've already... there have been periods of idolatry, and there has been a general rejection of the Lord. They're going around making... they're making... it wasn't King Uzziah, it's King Ahaz. Yeah, King Ahaz goes and makes a treaty with the king of Assyria, for example, instead of trusting in the Lord. So it's a problem that's existed in Judah even before the exile. Yeah, even before Babylon comes on the scene. So, good question. All right, so let's see. We should notice, by the way, some further similitude between the parable of the sower itself and the Lord's words to Isaiah. The parable of the sower is about how little actually grows up and bears fruit. It is essentially the remnant message that we find at the end of Isaiah's vision. In Isaiah 6:13, though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. And so the Lord planted a great deal of seed, then as well as in Jesus' time, but only very little of it actually survived to bear fruit. So we'll start from that point, Lord willing, on Sunday morning, because it's going to turn out there's a deeper connection between the commission of Isaiah 6 and the parable of the sower. So thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions and comments this evening.